Well, we are going to begin, and to be frank with you, I don't even know where to begin. But looking at the issues we are faced with the COVID-19, I think it may be a place to start, because it creates what Dr. Flynn had told me about turbulence, and he also stated that turbulence usually creates opportunities as well as risk. But before we get to that, I would hand over to my friend David to tell us what is about our position, what we do, and why we are pushing it forward. David?
Well, thank you. I'm glad to see so many friendly and, more importantly, interested faces in this topic of conversation today. The SDIG, the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, this is what we're all about. We're here to not only champion equality, equity, and social justice, but to do so through very fluid and dynamic engagement, to share ideas with each other, share best practices that can give other people ideas on how to make progress in their own areas. I think what says it best, if our group has recently put together some beliefs and values that our group adheres to, and I think two of them are very pertinent to here today. Number one, we believe that a safe space, one of mutual respect, is critical for meaningful engagement. So here today, between all of us panelists and also the viewers participating as well, this is a safe forum, one of mutual respect, where we respect what other people have to say. And secondly, we do believe that dialogue is essential to change. And that's really the crux of why we're here today, is to have this type of dialogue on this topic in particular today. And then maybe out of that, maybe through that exchange of ideas and thoughts and best practices, out of that, maybe we can affect some change somewhere that's positive and makes a positive improvement in people's lives. And that's what we're all about. Whether we're talking about the coronavirus here today, or whether we're talking about social economics, or whether we're talking about sexual harassment, or whatever the topic is, ultimately we want that dialogue to lead to a positive change for individuals. So here we are. I guess with that, Joseph, do you want me to lead off with a question for our panelists?
Well, I think I want it to be framed. I want to send it to someone who would kind of take the frame. Then as he frames it, then you can come in and ask questions as it might be. And that's, we're gonna be going to Flynn. And Dr. Flynn, I've spoken with you for quite some time. And you had indicated something that really struck me when you said that for 70-something years now, we have had a relatively, normal situation. And that actually gets me to thinking about what is normal. I think that we've seen so many chaotic situations, whether you want to go, maybe just go back to 2001, when the terrorists struck. As a result, Muslims became the people began to target, began to do all kinds of atrocious things to them. And today, this morning, I read about they recorded 600 Asian Americans had been harassed, and one thing or the other had been done to them. And then in addition, the people who are Asian American organizations that usually give fund or have proposal for fund for different things, they indicated that whenever it comes to Asian Americans, they call them model people. They don't look at the whole dimension of what they suffer and all they see, and so on and so forth. I don't even want to go into racism, but these are things that continue to happen, and some of us continue to bear the brunt of it. And that was what brought me to Flint when he made that comment, because I thought was very good. And besides, as I looked at his work, he's really well known worldwide. and he has inspired so many people to look into, as David said, dialogue, finding solutions to our problems. And he also is respected globally as someone who has the ability to frame or reframe mindset in order to figure out where we're going to go forward. And based on that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Flint to reframe the situation for us as to how we're going to go forward.
Well, thank you, Joseph, and hello again to several of you that I've chatted with before. I like to start out the conversation saying, how do we imagine the unimaginable? A month ago, could you imagine that we'd be here?
No.
Yeah, and just put yourself forward a year. Can you imagine what that's going to be like? I think this time, among other things, is a real challenge to our imagination. It's being able to see the world unfolding on a different path than the one we've been on. I'm a change consultant, organizational consultant, and I've been doing strategic planning and helping people as a futurist and as a trainer. And one of the things about the future is that it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. The future is really a temporal domain that we fill in. And we make up how we think the future is going to unfold based on the way we understand the world works now. And getting clear about the way we want to it unfold, our aspirational version of how it would unfold, is one of the real important features, both right now and in framing in general. And I use that technique of framing to try to get people to see things from a different perspective. And one of the most fundamental features of framing is to look at different time frames. And then when we tend to look at the future, we sometimes have a path that goes off into over the next hill. Using different time frames to construct, to extrapolate, to imagine a version of the future is an easy and very important sort of technique or tool to use to look at things from different perspectives. In this case, from different time frame perspectives. So one of the clients I work with around now, we're sort of organizing an internal crisis management team. And one of the things I've insisted on is that we have several different teams. One of them is looking at the next 2 weeks. One of them is looking at the next 2 months. One of them is looking at the next year to 2 years. And one of them is looking out 3 to 5 years. And the future we construct or we imagine in those different time horizons raise different issues. And I think we can also extend that beyond just 3 to 5 years, which for many of us at this point particularly seems like a long time.
Thank you very much, Flynn. I appreciate your framing it in context you have framed it. And I know that that will give us the foundations of which we can follow all kinds of trajectories to looking at different issues and framing it in our way to hopefully create the kind of society we all want to live in. David? Oh, is David?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, you can shoot your question, and what we try to do is to have the questions, presented, and then our panelists would answer the questions posed. With, at the end of that, we would have questions from the audience, and then we have our panelists may choose to ask generalized question, and at the end we're gonna end by having them summarize and tell us where we're going from here. So on that note, David, over to you.
Sure. I love when Dr. Busi was talking. I kept thinking about how great leaders not only have vision, but they also anticipate problems. And I was trying to work that into his imagination scenario, and it gives me a lot to think about. I'm going to hold that thought and ask this question of our group then. Knowing what we do about COVID, it being obviously the issue of the day, if not the issue of the year, a lot of people may not recognize links between a virus and work in the social justice or D&I arena. So my question to the panelists would be is, what do you say to people and how do you communicate to them that there are connections between a virus and social justice? So that's the question to the panel. How do you state those links to people?
Okay.
I'll go ahead and
Go ahead. All right, go ahead.
If that's okay. All right, so I think at the beginning we thought that the virus is going to be hitting everyone, and we looked and saw that Boris Johnson has been infected, and so many high-level people, and the impression that many people had was that it does not discriminate. It doesn't matter where the person is and how much money they have or what position they have, then the virus, does not discriminate. Well, until we look at the numbers, and we look at the numbers right here in the United States. And I think we look at the numbers across the world, and if we really look at the numbers and see who's been impacted, when we look at the number of deaths in New York, for instance, and in other states, we see that the African-American community has been impacted, where the percentage of death from the coronavirus in relationship to their percentage of the population, it's manyfold. And it could be that maybe the marginalized communities or the minority communities, their awareness is not where it needs to be, social distancing, et cetera, et cetera. It can also be that they're taking the lower level jobs that exposes themselves to maybe cleaning people at hospitals, maybe food providers and what have you. So we see the social justice issue coming up very bluntly in our face, saying there is an issue here that even the coronavirus is kind of following through with the people who are minorities, et cetera. They're being hit more than your normal population. Human life is sacred. It does not matter what color it is, but we just need to be very careful as stewards of this earth and as people of social justice on how our current situation is impacting everyone. And what do we need to learn from it to better ourselves? When we look at the prison systems, who's there? It's majority minority people. And we know that the prison systems are going to be one of the fastest infected populations that we have. So that's my take.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And let's go to Kitani. Could you, we as we do these things, we can see the interconnectedness of these issues as had been indicated by Somaya. But I would like to get Kenita in here to let us just discuss essentially how these things impact what she does and the implications as she moves forward in her work.
Thank you, Joseph. As Joseph said, that I actually do, I don't know that he said it, but my work is to do understanding culture workshops and promote inclusion through those workshops through transformational coaching and leadership development. And what I'm learning through all this with the COVID-19 and how it's impacting us from a social justice standpoint and how they come together is, as somebody that's not American yet, I'm Canadian, but I was born in India. So I'm considered third culture here in this country. And what I've noticed over the years with the work that we're doing is that there's one particular narrative that gets exposed often from a race standpoint in this country. And this COVID virus has uncovered that there are actually other narratives that are coming into play that are being forgotten. So for example, when we're talking about racism, as Somaya had brought up, and the struggles and the challenges that our African-American communities are being affected by, which is definitely not okay. We've often ignored the fact that Asian Americans are being, have had experiences of racism. And to me, that suggests that there's another narrative in this country, and there are multiple narratives in this country that we don't pay attention to. And so when one group gets, a lot of the attention, then our focus becomes narrow, and then we can't make change the way the world is changing and the way that we're all growing to look different going forward. So I think really appreciating different narratives, realizing that this is a global pandemic, but it's also impacting various groups in different ways. And so to honor and to respect each other's stories, but not to just jump on the bandwagon if it's one particular group, or to really help us change our language, I guess is what I'm trying to say as well. That growing forward, as we grow in, interracial relationships and different communities, refugees, and people are moving here, moving away, that we would be able to consider other narratives and stand by people in a more open, in a more inclusive sort of way.
My follow-up on that, if I could, with both of you, Somaya and you, Kenita, the additional narrative that this virus does discriminate, and the effects of that are not just death to individuals, but there are a whole host of other effects. Mm-hmm. How do we change that narrative, or what ways can we communicate this? I mean, everyone wants to focus on the number of cases and the number of deaths, but how do we highlight those other?
Do you mean just like highlighting them, like talking about them, or?
Yes. How do we start a dialogue on the topic of these other effects? I have seen, honestly, on some of the major networks that they have talked a little bit about the discrimination that's taken place with the African-American population and the prison population as well. But aside from these public media having this conversation, how do we as individuals have this conversation ourselves with other people, you think?
I think if I could just chime in for that, I think it's really important that we're more self-aware. And I feel like a lot of people don't seem to realize, and this is a general statement, don't seem to realize what their own cultural bent is. And so we tend to focus in on what's going on for me, where am I at, what am I needing to fix, instead of saying, yes, I am going through this stuff, but how can I think outside of myself? And so then to bridge that to what you're saying, how can we become more aware, is to realize that there are other people out there learning ways to connect, whether it's through technology. In our day and age right now, we have to only do it via technology, but to really find ways to connect and step into stories that are different than ours, and learn to relate to people that aren't experiencing life the same way. So whether it's a lower income family that we want to work with, help with, get to know better, or if it's a different racial group or what have you, it's an opportunity to kind of step into other people's stories and other people's mess. And then we realize that there's a bigger world outside of us.
Well, I agree with you, Kenita. That's absolutely right. And I'm sorry, I didn't tell y'all who I am or what I do. So I got so excited about the question, I just jumped right in. So I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I do a couple of things. One is I run a nonprofit called the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Atlanta. And I also have my own consulting company, very much like Kenita, what she does, in terms of bringing cultural awareness and cultural training to executives and organizations to help them work better together. And I'm also an executive coach. So in terms of the questions about how do we help, I totally agree with what you said. What I want to add is becoming an ally.
Yeah.
And becoming an ally means that if I know of somebody who is, who is going through a hard time from a different ethnic background than me, or different whatever group they might identify with, to be there for them and to be their voice, to check up on them, to see what I can do to help them. And just that is a huge step. Just want to share a really quick story happened today. I did a Zoom session last week and I got Zoom bombed. And it was really ugly, where people showed up and they showed porn pictures. They started harassing me, and I got a call from the Huffington Post when I write about it. So, I did the interview. The bishop of the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, read the article yesterday. And this morning he called me, left me a message and said, "We are there with you. We love you. We support you. We pray for you." So, I mean, getting a call like that means the world. And it made me think that I need to do that more for everyone. So just adding to what Kenita said.
Yeah, I like your word ally. I think that's so key. That really screams coming alongside, right? And that really screams showing partnership and, bolstering each other in the journey. I'm glad that happened to you. The phone call today, but I'm sad that it happened to you being Zoom. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Let's go to Dr. Flint. Dr. Flint, could you sort of elaborate more on the type of work you do and how that kind of work could help us in what we do?
Well, without going into specific traditional work that I've been doing, I think right now we're focused on this health event, which is precipitating economic and social turbulence and disruption. And I think I've always been trying to help people deal with what's emerging and develop the skills to do that. But I want to shift to a little different angle. And I'm sorry, Joseph, that's not the way you want to go with it. But I think the thing that really amazes me is how people are dealing with this uncertainty. At the heart of the matter is this notion that we don't know how it's going to shake out. We're kind of in a transition period, almost in a waiting, holding pattern till we figure out, whether we're dealing with a, class 1 or class 3 kind of fire. And I think that, the thing that really amazes me is the kind of fear that uncertainty brings. Most of us spend a lot of time trying to control things to work out the way we think they're supposed to. And that when we lose that sense of control, there's a fear that's normal. I think one of the interesting things is all fear is associated with how you project the future. Fear is a future frame emotion that we perceive vulnerability. And right now there's vast vulnerability, not necessarily in what's going to happen, but in the range and the lack of knowing what's going to happen. And I think that another way to look at that, uncertainty and the fear that goes with it, and it does for all of us. We look at our own issues, we look at our family issues, our neighborhood, our work, much less the world around us. And at the heart of that, as I've played with it, is that uncertainty that creates fear. The primary thing it does is it disempowers us. We find ourselves limited in what we can do for our personal lives, for what I call the web of care that we put energy and concern and time into, and then the broader macro context we find ourselves in. But that at the nub of this right now, I think is a question of power and powerlessness. the first power is recognizing what we don't have power over.
Mm.
Instead of denying or getting fearful where we're powerless, we need to acknowledge that and recognize we're in a vulnerable transition. We don't know how it's going to shake out, and we're vulnerable, all of us. Recognizing that's a very powerful thing to do, is to recognize where you don't have power. And so there's starting at a very deep personal level, and I find a lot of people spending way too much time on worrying about what the world's how it's gonna unfold, instead of taking these moments to really center ourselves and empower ourselves to do what we can, not only in this transition, but as we come out of this specific transition time. And, the number one thing we can do is choose what we think about. Well, we can't control other things. We don't control ourselves very well. Try sitting and not thinking about anything else for 1 minute. Try to control your emotions. But we do have power. We have choice. And what we choose to focus on, what we choose to deal with in our own lives, whether it's our own health, our own habits, our own programming that needs to be reviewed, so that we're not disempowering ourselves, but we're actually reorienting our center of gravity where that power comes from. So, whether that's about your own personal life and habits, emotional habits, mental habits, spiritual habits, or the way we relate to others, or in the way we engage the outside world, all of those have a new paradigm. And within that paradigm are things that we can't do much about, and some of them we can't do much about now. But there are a lot of things we still have power over. And I think in a way, the heart of the diversity and inclusion issue is also a power dynamic. Who gets to choose how we operate, how we organize, how we relate to each other? And that same power is where, in order to shift that social paradigm, those people who share the kind of values that were mentioned earlier need to take their power to start making those changes. And right now, things are loosened up. This is going to be a great opportunity to shift that paradigm. And I think in one way we could shift it, and it could be a lot better. There's a lot of opportunity, and focusing on the opportunity where you can do something is a lot different than worrying about all the stuff you can't do anything about. It's empowering, not disempowering. And so looking forward is to ask the question, not just how do we deal with some of the downside risk, but how do we see this as a lifetime opportunity to engage, to work on ourselves, to work on our relationships with the things people and places and things we care about, and work on our global paradigm that is already in unsustainable crisis. This virus, in my opinion, has simply shined the light on what we already knew. And that the same issues are going to be looking for us when we come out of the other end of this tunnel. And the challenge is us to come out with a new kind of inclusive power, instead of dividing the pie into my piece of the power.
I agree with you. I think that's very powerful, but I do want to highlight disability, if I may. When we talk about fear, and I'm going to try and take some of what all has been said and kind of compile it together. But when we talk about fear, by the way, my name's Tabitha Pope, and I'm a disability director, disability inclusion here in Oklahoma. So what I was trying to say is fear is irrational, it's illogical, and it has a negative effect on people's behavior, especially when you talk about marginalized groups. right? They're already in a place where they don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of resources, they don't have a lot of privilege, they don't have a lot of health care. They have so many barriers stacked against them that to say that this is an opportunity almost at times can feel like someone's spitting in their face because they're trying to survive and take care of their kids and do the best that they can. And so I don't want to downplay the opportunities that exist, because it's phenomenal to see people to come together because they have to, regardless of differences, and they have to focus on a project and they have to be successful at it, right? So I love that. But when we talk about those with disabilities and we talk about where they are today, let's talk about digital equity. Let's talk about the fact that they don't have access. They don't have internet access. They don't have technology necessarily. And a lot of, if they're lucky, they have a phone that works, right? But can they learn, right? Do they get that same educational experience that those in the city are getting? Yeah, no, they don't. And then let's talk about the fact that they're having to now go home to an abuser or to a home that doesn't have food. And now we're talking about fear from a different standpoint, aren't we? And we're seeing kids put in compromising positions, women being put in compromising positions because they're in the home stuck with their abusers or without resources. So all of that is disability. All of that, it has a real negative impact right now, and it's a real concern. And it's a concern to understand that they're not getting the information that we're getting. So when we talk about discrimination and we talk about people jumping on another population because they don't get it, well, they really didn't get it, maybe. Have we talked about that?
Thank you. I want us to shift gear here. I wanna make sure that our panelists are able to articulate what they do and how what they do relates to the essence of our being. That's SDIG, because all these things are so helpful. But let's just put it under inside a box we call the power structure and how it's played. Those who don't have it usually don't have the privilege of exercising it, and they are just taking it. And those who have it sometimes have the ability to exercise it however they choose. But the common thing now is that this COVID-19 has exposed all of us, and all these inequities, mistreatment of people, and so on and so forth, the one that are within our control or outside our control. All these things are in plain sight. Anyone that denies or wants to sweep it under the rug is either deceiving himself or not trying to figure out the way forward. The way forward is crucial. And if it's crucial, we must have to understand how the dynamics of power plays. Mm-hmm. So from that vantage standpoint, I would like to have Sonmaya elaborate more on what she does and how she will take all these things that we are putting out here in furthering what she does that will be consistent with our values at SDIG.
Sure. So, I really appreciate everyone's input and what's being shared, because it's really enriching me right now, and my mind is going about, what I'm doing and what am I missing and how can I even be better. And thank you so much for the opportunity to learn from all of you. It's a day by day. Things are changing so fast, and people's fears are evolving. It's health fears. It's the financial crisis fear. It's will I have a job fear. It's my 401k now has become a 201k. truly. You know, worried about our loved ones, people who have health issues, and what if they get exposed to the virus, and just overall watching the news and how many people have died worldwide and all that. So it's really, really depressing. And working with right now remotely with my my clients who are executives doing executive coaching, we work on what do they need to be doing now? What do they need to be doing now? And, you know, and some of the things that we talk about, you know, Flynn talked about the what do we have power over and what do we not have power over? And just knowing that is very powerful. So what I found to work with my executives is doing a SWOT analysis of the situation. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? And by doing that, as you all know, the strength and the weaknesses, these are internal. What I and you and anybody could impact. And so I get them to do this exercise, and when they put the outside factors, and those are things that they really can't impact, but they can impact their own situation, and how to maximize the things that are going for them, and how to move the weaknesses into strength or minimize them. And that seems to really resonate with them a lot. And talking about communication. As a leader in a mode of crises, leaders need to be communicating more. So again, with my clients, we talk about who is it that they need to be communicating with. And I get them to go through their organization, also personal life. Who is a high potential for them? And I get them to like put them into categories. And I had a client this morning, and she said, well, we have group meetings every week. And so with my own boss and my colleagues, and we have team meetings. I said, well, do you reach out to your colleagues and just say, hey, I really appreciate what you said in the meeting today, and I'm just checking in on you on a personal level. And she said, well, you know, I don't do that, but that's really a great idea. And so we really need to be communicating and working with people to help them, because when we help others, we help ourselves. And we are in this all together. We're not on islands anymore. And I think that's been said before. This virus has proved that we are part of the world and the world is part of us. So when we have economic sanctions against countries, when we have all those things going on, it's only hurting us here at the end of the day. So if we don't work together as one humanity, we are going to be not doing well in the long term. So it's a wake-up call, as was said earlier, for us to realize that. Mm-hmm. And how is the world going to be when this is over? It's not going to be the way we had it before. It's going to be different.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's great. Can I chime in for a second?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, just to add, I really appreciate what you were saying, Samaya. And one of the ways that I just want to reframe a little bit what Flynn had said earlier about power and powerlessness, right? But then tying in, where'd she go, Tabitha? You know, I really appreciated what you said as well in terms of our communities of disability that feel the marginalizing that much more in this situation. Because the pandemic is a trauma, right? And if it's traumatizing all of us, I can only imagine how some of these marginalized communities are being traumatized that much more, whether they have the resources or they don't have the resources. But then even just from a fear standpoint, I think Flynn had mentioned something about fear. And, you know, it really depends on if we're going to do this work of inclusion and, you know, dig into the diversity and help people from all walks of life in various areas, we ourselves have to appreciate, how are we handling this trauma? How are we approaching this? What are we doing in order to impact them in a positive way, which then as a result becomes a ripple effect, right? It's not just for those of us that are coaches, it's for all of us to appreciate that this pandemic is a trauma. And so how are we, you know, living into it in a way that helps people heal from their fears? The stuff that causes the fear might not go away, but they can become stronger and they can become more empowered in that space. But then also realizing that when you think of communities that are already feeling powerless for one reason or another, and then fear kicks in, that's so debilitating, right? And so it's just, it can be overwhelming. So I think one of the ways that I've had to address that in my own story is to say, okay, I can't do all of it, right? Who can agree with me that we can't do it all in any of our lanes, right? We can only make the difference in our, like I kind of say, my 8.5 by 6 inches on the floor, space. And so I've kind of thought through who in my story is close enough that I could implement my work, but also empower and encourage them. And in my case, right now, it's college students. College students are some of the ones that are feeling marginalized because of all the challenges that they're going through. Their graduation ceremonies are canceled. Some of their classes have been, removed, and now they have to fly back home and be home with their family that they haven't seen in so long. And so all of these crazy things, they're not able to be with their students, their peers. And so walking with them in the space of helping them be more empowered and encouraged during this trauma, I think has been, I can't change what's causing them the fear, but I can definitely empower and equip them. And so I love how Samaya was also talking about how she, does some of that. I think that's really crucial, that we focus on the areas that we can make a difference, because then that gives back to us, but then we also then hopefully make a ripple effect happen across the pond, if you will.
Definitely.
Well, let me throw in another. Oh, excuse me. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Flynn.
I did a workshop several years ago, titled "The Need for Security, the Emotion of Fear, and the Virtue of Courage." And I certainly don't suggest that fear is a bad thing. It's a very wonderful thing, because there's real dangers out there. And realizing that choices have consequences and some of them aren't the ones you want is why we're lucky to have a radar that can anticipate vulnerability so we can respond appropriately. But there's also kind of a toxic fear that is different. It's when we imagine things that are low probability or low impact, and that we're anxious. And then there's what I'm going to just call sort of a low grade mindset fear. There's just things we sort of stay anxious about: our jobs, our health, our relationship. Those don't get solved to the degree that we, and so I think teasing out, and the centerpiece of all that is the ability to muster courage in the face of fear. Courage is different than bravery. Bravery is when you don't recognize the danger. Courage, is when you are afraid, when you're experiencing the fear of your vulnerability and insecurity, when we can muster courage to overcome that fear, to walk through that fear. It doesn't mean stupid. It does mean that that's what the resource within us that we need to draw on to reframe the challenges, to empower us, to give us resourcefulness for dealing with them, not just using the same habits and same patterns that we've been using, either individually or culturally, to try to solve these new problems.
Okay. All right. I think we are getting to a point where we would like to get questions from, sort of exchanging questions. Could be from the public, could be from the panelists, so that we can really dissect some of these things and hopefully figure out, which you've already articulated, what we are supposed to be taking out as we go into dealing with the world as we see it. Hopefully the weather will change and this virus will go away, and then we can return to normal. But I don't believe it's normal anymore, but you just have to keep reframing it. So if you have questions, you could, go.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, everyone. I had a couple of questions, if I may ask. This is Athena from Switzerland near Geneva. One of the questions that I have in terms of the data, I believe Somaya mentioned about, for example, when we look at deeper into the data, we can see the number is not only, for example, as we say, it's not discriminating. So in regards to data, because one of the things I have trouble finding the statistic on different countries in, for example, basically disaggregated data in terms of the gender, age, or ethnicity, or data that has been gathered. I cannot easily find in Europe, and I haven't seen comprehensive data coming from United States. So I was wondering if you have the sources, what kind of data you have seen, or if there are public resources that actually in terms of the data, would it be possible to be shared by to the members here as well?
The data that I was referring to was actually in the national news here in the US, and I'll be more than happy to, I'm looking for it right now, and as soon as I find it, I could put it in chat. How does that sound?
That would be perfect. Thank you. That would be perfect. Thank you. And the second question that I have in regards, particularly Flynn, you mentioned about it in terms of the fear. One of the challenges that I see today was particularly in Europe, as well as I work very closely with humanitarian organizations. I do like diversity inclusion audit. I write case study on different scenario, or looking at the policy and procedures, and looking particularly in terms of the operationalizing the diversity and inclusion, how they can better operationalize those policies, that how to interpret the policy into actionable strategies. And one of the challenges that I see at the moment with a lot of humanitarian organizations, as well as many others, particularly NGOs such as UN agencies, things that it was important 3 months ago, 6 months ago, and when it comes to diversity and inclusion, is no longer the first priority. And that is one of the biggest challenge that I see. For example, let's say if an organization that 3 months ago wanted to do diversity and inclusion audit to see how they are doing, today is not important. And how can we actually convince those organizations to say that it is as important as before? It's the fear that they have at the moment. They call it business continuity, business continuity, business continuity, because they want to make sure that the organization is working as effective as before. And a lot of people, as it was mentioned here, a lot of people here, for example, in Switzerland, even within UN organizations or humanitarian organizations, they are afraid of losing their job, and because their job was not kind of essential to the business, but at the moment, because they cannot, in Switzerland, because of the law, they cannot go on unpaid leave, they may lose their job. So what I want to say, what I want to ask you, how can we actually, when we respond to the organization to say that diversity and inclusion work is still as important as before, even perhaps in some cases when we talk about gender-based violence, or for example, disability mainstreaming is more important than before. How can we actually convince, having a convincible argument with the organization to say that don't stop the work at diversity and inclusion, still it needs to continue? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. Can anyone take on that question?
That was the point.
Yeah, I'll just say, again, back to what Edna was saying, I've had an experience in Geneva myself along that lines with the UN organization I was working with at the time on gender equality. And honestly, what swayed a lot of people to the cause of gender equality was not so much the data. Certainly the data is helpful, especially with the scientific-minded community, but it really goes back to what was said earlier about sharing stories. And I had found in conversations and working with some of these UN organizations that they're inundated a lot of times with statistics. And it's only when we share the stories that those statistics get meaning. So I think one thing we have to make a practice of is coupling stories with statistics in a sense, in my mind. I found that to be very effective.
Thank you, David. That's a very good point. It's funny that you mentioned that, because one of my latest job, which is actually being paused at the moment till foreseeable situation, it was actually gathering a story under case studies from different national society in International Committee of Red Cross and Red Crescent, in the stories that actually diversity inclusion worked, and if it, or situation that it didn't work, and if it didn't work, why was it, what was the story, what happened, to actually writing it in a very easy, comprehensible, without jargon, without detailed data and statistic in it, but based on the factual aspects that it happened. But and that was a kind of the way that we actually tell the stories of the success or something that didn't work and why. However, this particular job that actually had to be paused, of course, one aspect is the COVID, but that also the main aspect is that it's also not main kind of aspects of the business to continue the business.
May I add one thing, an idea? There is nothing more powerful to many than the SWOT analysis, or just a comparison of the opportunities and then the pros and the cons. Having a visual that if you could fill it out, or if you could have a group fill it out, then you're not trying to persuade or motivate someone to do something that they don't want to do, but maybe they can come to the conclusion themselves when they fill out these very simple analysis of how it's important or not important.
I think that's a very good point. I know when I did my research, including when I was teaching research classes, one was that you can numbers and tell the number to represent whatever you choose to make. But when you begin to use story narratives, say, for instance, if you're familiar with Jonathan Kozo, who had used the stories to really get people into whether you want to look at it from inequities in schools, communities, the implications of extended consequences of what may affect parents, then it will go to their community, it will go to their children, to go all so on and so forth. But a lot of schools are good at they will say, no, we do X, Y, and Z, and they show you data. And what I've seen personally is that in some cases, say for instance, a school may say, we don't have diverse student population, so we're gonna do something about it. Then in summer, they could bring all the people who are not even equipped to take the classes they are supposed to. At the end of the summer, all these people are gone. At the end of the year, the statisticians and those who are able to manipulate those data would use it to show or demonstrate to the Department of Education that they have 6-7% when they know that they don't even have 1%. And so there are so many things that are associated with these issues that sometimes we don't know. That's why I advocate for those who fight whether to use qualitative research or quantitative research to pause the fight and begin to include both. Combination of both research will give you much more authentic answer to the issues you may be looking at.
I want to add something here, just on the ground. When you have businesses who have, the majority has suffered financially and economically, those who get the importance of diversity and inclusion will come back and do it more. Those who don't get it, they will not. They will go back to business as usual because they want to impact the bottom line, and they see diversity and inclusion is fluff that is for the outside consumption, and I'm worried about the bottom line. Don't give me that D&I stuff. So
Right.
this is just my gut feeling of how this is going to play out.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah.
I had a question, Devan here. What if this has, again to the panelists, what if we had played this whole scenario differently? You know, Flynn, about your question on fear. What if the whole scenario of control was not established by the government? I mean, as of today, or probably a month back, 3,000 people died every day with accidents, car accidents, road accidents, every day, right? We never stopped driving. You know, we continue to drive, we continue to get our products from overseas, but 3,000 people on record die every day. What if we did not have this lockdown and control and just had let people operate? Would that have been social injustice had we done that? Because we wouldn't be talking about all the other issues right now had that happened. We wouldn't be talking about economy issues. We wouldn't be talking about employment issues, 401k, students, nothing, right? We would have just carried on. The strong would have survived, but at the same time, people with less health facility wouldn't have, right? I mean, me coming from India, you know, polio is one of the key issues as we grew up. I had friends who had polio, and the government had to take effort to go house to house to, to get kids, get the polio drops to eradicate polio. It took time. Malaria still exists in India. And that's why they're getting the malaria medicine from India as an example, because they couldn't eradicate. And people survived. People still died with dengue and malaria every day in India. It continues to happen right now. And people learn to survive because it's a point of survival. The current issue that we are dealing with right now because of economic challenges are what people in Syria and war-torn countries are currently facing right now. And there's no stop to it, right? They don't have some of the benefits that we had. They probably don't have electricity at all. They live in lamps and lights. And so the question is to the panelists, if we had played this differently, where we continue to operate as usual, had this pandemic go on to have the strong survive, people with capability survive, would that have been social justice? And how would social justice would have played in that scenario?
Very good question.
Well, I can add a few things. A few things to that. Social justice cannot happen without education, right? Awareness. And so if we want if we are thinking about survival of the fittest, then this is what we've been having. The strongest will always prevail. And the people who need most help, just like today with the virus, will be left behind. We can take education, and I want your help. I want your ideas for improvement here. Everything begins with education. And so when we look at the educational system, our students are not learning. They are just educating, meaning they get a degree, but they are not learning. They are not thriving. We emphasize growth, meaning we have to increase enrollment. Oh yeah, why? So we can meet the quota. Oh yeah, why? So we can make our stockholders happy. Really? How about the students? So the students are not really educated to think about the skills they need to survive and to really have meaning and purpose in life. And those skills are precisely the skills all of you talked about, beginning with Dr. Flynn. We're talking about mindset. I wrote a couple of books on mindsets, successful mindsets. I wrote another book on empowerment. Yeah, books are great, but if just reading a book will help, we wouldn't have $1 billion industry books on self-development and coaching and dieting and all of this. So I want to know, in your view, how can we not really change? It has to really be reformed, I suppose, from ground up. How do we make sure this generation and future generation, they grow up understanding that to have meaning in life and to have purpose in life, you need to have a set of skills that you can use to craft your journey and to not be afraid to take on challenges and to push limits and to really explore different areas so we can achieve our full potentials. If we don't do that, what we are experiencing now is going to be the new normal, if you want to call it that way, meaning that the people in power will write the laws, will come up with new laws so they can have even better benefits, so they can have better opportunities for themselves. And the rest of us will just have the jobs, the 9-to-5 jobs, and the paycheck, which many people have been really accustomed to. You see, I'm not American. I am from Europe. I wasn't brought up thinking that, you know, you need to be quiet, go to school, get that diploma, get a job. What? Is really life just about having a job? I think it's really, this is our opportunity to change this narrative. This is our opportunity to go into the classrooms and to really teach what the students need to learn. Because guess what? Everyone will benefit when we do. Here we go. Education, the graduation and retention will go up. These people then, right, they are going to be empowered. They will join the workforce. And you and I can really hire people that are prepared to make the impact we want in the world. So everyone benefits when we have inclusion and diversity, but we have to start with education and awareness.
That's right. That's right.
Good job, Val. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, comment briefly. Yeah, I think there's always a temptation to say, if we could run the tape back, what would we have done differently? When I was an executive, the only thing I had people turn in weekly was what I called a mistake report. And you had to turn in once a week what you did wrong. I mean, the way I defined a mistake was something you do differently next time. Well, I think looking back at things we would have done differently and learning is a very valuable thing. But I remember when I was a kid, I used to take it back and take it back and take it back. And I was furious with Adam and Eve for screwing the whole thing up. But I do think that, from my perspective, all of the critical issues that we're going to face when this relatively temporary health scare blows through are the same issues we had going in. We're not going to go back, you know, whether this is a minor bump in the road or whether this is a ditch is to be determined. But that the things that make diversity and inclusion important prior to this storm make it important now and are going to make it more important in the future. And that I think that this initial trauma is going to give way to, I think, a decade or more of pretty fundamental global civilizational transformation, and it could go on a lot longer than that. And the issues that we're all talking about that are being highlighted by this current situation are all the issues that we needed to deal with the whole time. And so I think that what changes right now is that people's minds are blurred. We don't know how it's going to shake out. And it opens up an opportunity for us to start crafting how it's going to work out. I have commented several times, picking up again, 3,000 car wrecks. Guess the number of people who died last year in the United States from flu. Somebody how many? What's the number?
Maybe 70,000.
80,000 people died last year. We already have an epidemic.
Yeah.
This is not new news. There are some difference in this pandemic as it hits the shore, but this is the 6th pandemic we've had in 9 years. This is not a new thing. It's not oh my God, can you imagine? It's been going on. We just sort of got through with the MERS thing a year ago. And before that, it was the swine flu and Ebola.
It's not a new thing, but people are affected by it differently. And that is the problem.
Oh, I understand. I'm just saying pandemics per se have been in our game plan and are going to continue to be in our world. The real challenge of how do we make it relevant right now is the same challenge we face all the time in diversity and inclusion. How do you make that not just interesting, but essential? Where's the value proposition to saying we can do better when we're pulling the same direction than when everybody's pulling their own direction? And that's the fundamental challenge. And I think inclusion and diversity is going to move into a center stage role, because it's not just the fringes. There's going to be deep, deep pressures to disaggregate and disempower the parts that make up this culture and this world. And I think the challenge we need to provide is the leadership to bring those together and not let people just assume that we're going to go back to the screwed up way it was before this happened a month ago.
I think, Flynn, also one of the key thing that makes this pandemic very interesting is that we don't know what the solution is in terms of a vaccine, right? Compared to all the others, we'll say there's a flu shot. I mean, whether you get to protection or not, doesn't matter, but we always knew when you take a flu shot, your risk is lowered. I think the challenge with this one is we don't have a flu shot yet or a global vaccine yet. That's putting a lot of people at comfort, to say, hey, there's no flu shot, there's no coronavirus shot, let's not get it. I think that fear of getting it prevents us from doing a lot of other things compared to the other ones.
No, I think there are certainly some differences, not only in this viral flu without as well as our response to this and the cascading set of events that are going to come out of this. No question. This is, in my opinion, this is the unique event in many of our lives. It's a defining event for a generation, and that there'll be two windows in the future. It'll be BC and AD, before Corona and after the disease.
Yeah, PD, yeah, pandemic.
I just think the challenge is to, in this moment where everything's on pause, we don't know how it's going to shake out. And our challenge is to figure out how it needs to be changed so that when it does move back in, we have shifted gears to pulling together instead of having a system that pulls us apart.
Agreed.
I have to make a couple of statements here, observation. Flint, as you made the comment relating to windows, having the two windows, I think one of the things I like about how you state things is that always kind of leaving a window of hope. But I was sort of really cringed when I heard of, survival of the fittest. I wondered, what kind of life do we want? If we will embrace the survival of the fittest, they seem like we're going back to the, when people could go and kill people just to take their things, and some other people would do some other things that are, that doesn't give us hope. I think Val made some crucial points when she was talking about education. And I tend to agree with her that education is perhaps the most fundamental of things we have to get to. And that's why part of what we are doing here is engagement. We intend to elaborate more. We intend to study more. We intend to gain understanding. My book was about misconceptions people have. And those with misconceptions, you tend to drive them. I don't know how you feel about it, but when I read whether it's in India about caste system, or go to Africa, look about Africa and the issues there, and then come here, look at the sort of tier system of economics, or where you live determines whether your zip code determines what kind of loan you get, whether it's for business or for some other things. So I'm disturbed by that concept of, if you want to phrase it that way, concept of whoever has the power could do whatever he or she can, and then everything will be good. I'm very disturbed by that. However, I feel like this engagement and looking at these things and striving for equality, fair treatment for all, perhaps will be part of what I think we will all gain from this.
Let me just make a quick comment and then introduce my friend Bryce.
Okay.
Survival of the fittest does not mean dominance of the strongest. You know, the cockroaches are going to inherit the world. And so, you know, fitness is not about your physical fitness or your financial fitness. It's how well you fit into a changing environment. And we need to understand that fitness is not a hierarchical thing. It is an adaptive thing. And those that survive will be the ones that effectively adapt. But let me switch just a minute and introduce my friend Bryce Flulin, who joined us today, who I've worked with in the past, who's an amazing person, works in the area of food and nutrition, and is a wonderful person. And I'm glad you joined us, Bryce. Why don't you introduce yourself briefly and add some of your special sauce.
Special sauce. That's a great intro. Hello, everybody. I've been just really intently listening, and everybody's, you know, and learning. And thank you, Flynn, for inviting me. I'm here in Los Angeles. My work has been in underserved communities over the last 20 years. I'm specifically right now working in the community of Inglewood. And so, you know, for me, you know, I've learned from everyone on this panel, who everyone's spoken, but for me, I also always, you know, have tried to challenge myself to continually have a lens of equity and think about the privilege that I have and how I can be able to contribute to those who aren't privileged, who don't have the opportunities that I do. I come from a grandmother who barely had a third grade education. So to what Tabitha was saying, really looking at communities like when, you know, what Flynn was saying about fear and all the anecdotal information that you gave us on how to combat that is all true. But what Tabitha was saying is true as well. There are people that, you know, I just met a family last week that has 6 kids. If you don't know about LA, people are already on the edge, you know, income, people paying almost 40, 50% for rent. So they were already on the edge, and this is taking people over the edge who maybe end up losing their jobs, and they could end up being homeless. So for me, who has the privilege to have a job, to have a home, to have an income, to try to tell someone not to be fearful when they could be out on the street, I think, you know, can be tone deaf. So what I've tried to do is always kind of look at what can I do to make sure I'm supporting those who have less than me. That's my obligation while I'm here on Earth. So we have people who are food insecure, which was something that Flynn talked about that was happening before. All the things that, you know, the social issues that we as a country and not, you know, and people on this panel know, but all the social issues that a lot of us knew about, they are being exasperated now. People are, you know, falling into homeless, people who barely had, you know, one paycheck away from being out on the street. That paycheck is lost. People who were food insecure. So, you know, I worked in nutrition, and when I first came in, I'm a chef by trade. When I first started my work in the community, I thought it was just enough to give people the information and the resources. That's just part of the puzzle. Like, if you don't have access to food or healthy food, or you can't afford it, you know what I'm saying, me telling you that you should eat strawberries is a moot point. And so I've really tried to make sure my work is dedicated to eliminating and breaking down those systems and barriers, you know, while I'm here on Earth. The other thing is that, to what Flynn was talking about, is that we need to understand that we have an opportunity right now to come out of this and break up all these barriers and systems that we talked about that are creating all this inequity, right? And so we should be those who have the privilege to really kind of take a step back and think, and be on calls like this, really need to think about how can we utilize our power to shift that balance. Diversity inclusion to me is that, and one of the young ladies is asking, how can you sell that to people who think just about bottom line? To me, you know, if you're not having a diversity of thought at the table, then you're not going to be innovative, and you're going to fall behind. All these people on this call prove that today. So I'm interested in being around people like this who are leading those charges, who get it, who want to say, hey, we need a diversity of thought at the table. We need people from all economic backgrounds, from all different industries, from all different ways of life to be a part of the power structure in order to break it down. So, you know, that's what, you know, I try to do in my work. But I mean, the bottom line, to make it real, you know, to close out, to make it really simple, is that You know, I'm here by, you know, from other folks that have given to me. So for me to turn my back and say, oh, I have whatever, and now I'm just going to continue to build on just me and my family, that's not acceptable at all, you know. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you so much.
thank you for having me.
Can I just say something about the just the survival of the fittest?
Just briefly, please.
Okay, real briefly. I think, you know, I appreciate what you're saying, Flynn. I think that makes a lot of sense in the bigger picture, but I think, and I can't speak for Dr. Joseph, but I feel like, you know, if we're not coming alongside each other and kind of building that out, then we're not going to be able to survive no matter how fit we are. And culturally, different groups are going to appreciate that differently as well, right? And so for me, when I hear survival of the fittest, and then I hear Joseph's comment, and I kind of put all the comments together, I'm kind of being challenged with that assimilation word, saying, okay, so if I assimilate to what you all are doing, or whoever the you is, then I'm going to get stronger. But what if I can't? What if I can't assimilate? What if I don't have the resources? What if I don't have the language? What if I don't have this, that, or the other to assimilate, right? Then I'm not going to fit. I'm not going to belong. And then I end up feeling like, wow, I guess I'm not part of the team. I'm not part of this human race, you know? And so just thinking about that in terms of how does assimilation fit into that space? Because it doesn't really talk about inclusion if we're challenging people to, you know, survival of the fittest and move forward, to me speaks differently. So, but I appreciate it from both sides.
Thank you. David, you want to take it away from here?
Thank you. And boy, this last statement really has me thinking about the fact that sometimes assimilation does go 360 degrees away from inclusion, and that's a strong point to end on. But let me go back and kind of go through what we have talked about during this session. I think it was a great session, by the way. But anyway, I think it was Ganita and so Maya kind of led off talking about the fact that this virus that we're facing right now does discriminate. Its effects are discriminatory for different groups. And we talked about disabilities, as Tabitha brought up. We talked about prison population and African Americans, et cetera, et cetera. With that conversation we had, to me, one of the biggest points we had was that there's narratives going on, they're getting all the attention when the alternate narratives are not. And so it's a matter of figuring out ways to make these alternate narratives heard. One of these ways is through stories. We talked about the power of stories. And we also talked about another way to do this is to become an ally, to help foster not only the narrative itself, but also the support of individuals along with that. And so becoming an ally was very critical to our discussion. And it came up a number of times during our discussion. Mr. Flynn talked very openly about how we're operating in an environment of fear and what that fear means. And he wanted to reframe that, however, into a paradigm that says this shouldn't necessarily be a matter of vulnerability, but also a matter of opportunity. Great opportunity here to reframe your own self-analysis, do the self-analysis, reprioritize what you're doing in life, but also reframe this publicly and change the paradigm to opportunity there. One thing this virus is doing that was brought up is highlighting a lot of these social issues that we are very concerned with. And so maybe if you want to look at it that way, that is a good thing that has come out of this, is that some of these social issues are being highlighted. And maybe we should embrace that paradigm shift that's occurring within that. I think that was a very good point made by Flynn, and followed up by Bryce as well, saying the same thing. We talked about connecting stories with research and how powerful that was. And then I think we spent a lot of the in part of the conversation on this idea of survival of the fittest and our take on that. Flynn again suggested that survival of the fittest is a matter of adaptation. And we had that conversation from Kania about how much of that adaptation is really assimilation and how does that affect inclusion. Ultimately, I think it comes down to what Val said, and she originally brought up this topic, was survival, the fittest are those that are educated. And so education is the key to the whole thing. And this really comes back full circle to the beginning when we talked about the narrative. All this is about sharing information, educating people so that they can be fitter, and having these dialogues that enhance awareness of all these social justice issues. And that, ultimately, that's what our group is all about, is having these type of conversations and ensuring that this dialogue is had and finding ways to educate people to make them fitter, to make them more aware of these social justice issues. And all these things we talked about for the last hour and a half are all tied around that central aspect of dialogue and education and awareness.
David, I just want to make sure that we capture what Tabitha said in terms of people who are differently able and how this is so multi-layered, and it impacts them even more. So I just want to make sure that that goes on record.
Yes, yep. And that's one of those groups we talked about, you know, African Americans being discriminated against by this virus, as well as prison population and the disabled. And mind you, that, again, that's only 3 groups highlighted, and we could apply that to other groups as well, as you very well know.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me just add one last comment, and I don't mean to be defensive, but I did not say, and I do not think fear is a bad thing, nor is the objective to get rid of fear. Courage and fear always exist at the same time. You can't have courage if you don't have fear. And the degree of fear determines the degree of courage that is necessary to overcome that fear. So fear is not something you want to get rid of. It's something you want to harness for your own empowerment, not to let it disempower you and to make you less resourceful. There are real things to worry about, but we never handle them better when we allow our fear to de-empower us instead of recognizing the limits of our power and doing what we can in the face of fear, not to avoid it.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Thank you.
Well, I think, you know, we certainly learned, for me, I think I learned so much. What I would ask is, where do we go from here? How do we frame this so that if the fear stems from experience somebody may have, that the person may have some sort of don't have the ability to control that fear, it comes down to what I usually say, that we have 2 ways to see things. There are things we can control and there are things we cannot control. So the best thing we can do is to put in the energy to control what we can do and do it the best. But for the ones we cannot control, such as the things that are, you know, has to be brought into this equation, say like degradation of environment for, you know, for what it is, or people not even having the kind of opportunity to move forward, that those fear and other things will cumulatively subject them to a situation where we'll be seeing some, like they say, 70% of the people dying are African Americans, and less than 30-something%. Then I saw a woman who was crying about her child that was serving at the grocery store. Asian Americans, that we are helping people at the hospital, the doctors and these professionals, and some nincompoop was there castigating them, making disparaging statements against them. How do we deal with those type of things?
I think that falls in the realm of difficult conversations, and this kind of goes back to what Val was earlier. That education is not just about job preparedness. We need to educate our youth on how to engage on some of these social justice issues, how to become better human beings rather than just better lawyers or better doctors or better marketing agents or whatever their career field is, how to make them better human beings so that we're able to have these difficult conversations with other people that aren't being humane in a sense, and just start there again. I think with the education piece, educate people how to have these kind of conversations.
Well, I want to jump on that. When we talk education, we want it simple, we want it clear, we want it to hit all the different aspects of communication that we can possibly hit in order to get the most people educated. Does that make sense? So we're talking about students, we're talking about how do they communicate, we're talking about business people, what's their best mode of communication, college students. So when we talk about what practical steps, it's positive, clear, practical steps in various modes of communication, and we have to all send it out. So it's our stories shared in a positive way in every way we can. I think that's essential, and it's simple, and everyone can do it.
I was also going to say it's important to discover what the common ground is. We work very hard at, when we talk about inclusion in our business, we say very clearly that we're looking for things that unite us, not what divide us. And so if automatically we assume that you are different than me, then we'll get fear and we get anxious and we're like nervous to have that interaction. And if it's a case where I don't understand students or I don't understand, you know, there was something that Bryce had said, right? And so that I was just remembering. So if I don't understand some of these things, I'm going to be on my heels. So maybe it's a stop, take a step back, look what you know, put some space between us and the situation, and then look for what unites us. We have a Venn diagram that we've, you know, built up, looking, and there are 5 things that we actually have in common as humans that we all have. And when we can level the playing field, we can hear each other more effectively, I think. And then it makes us more human than just different groups, right? That diversity piece.
Right.
I concur to that.
All right.
I think there is one piece missing that we didn't hear much today, and that is political. Everything is political, whether you like it or not. And I think in this country, we have this apathy when it comes to politics, where you can throw that you know, religion in there or income, right? They tell you, oh, you're not supposed to talk about politics and money. What? Everything is political. So if you're not talking about politics, then you have no idea how anything works. So let's go back to the basics and find out, why don't we have politics in our school system? If the government is for the people, by the people, why don't we educate the people? I mean, it's unbelievable. So we need to, I don't know how here together or in our individual spaces, our individual environments, we need to bring the political aspect into the equation, because we are not going to solve much without understanding the power of politics when it comes to, you know, what laws we have in place, how laws are affected and rules. Who makes the laws? Who are the people making the law, and for whom? Who's on the agenda? So, you know, politics, it's so important that we definitely need to bring it into the conversation and learn how to make people aware that they have a role. As an American citizen, you have responsibilities and you are accountable, you know, to what you want to happen to you. So if you are not participating, if you are not engaged, if you are not involved, if you are not out there, you know, fighting for your right and speaking up for what you believe in, then this is what happens. You fall for everything and you go with everybody because you don't know what's going on. So you can speak up. You can talk about any of these things that are important.
Thank you, Val. Let's just go to our panelists for them to give us their closing remarks. Let's go to Katina, please. Could you go, please? Kenita, please.
What did you want me to do? I'm sorry.
We're looking at you are giving closing remarks. So if you could give us some closing remarks, then, you know, that would be good. You know.
Yeah, I guess, you know, at the end of the day, even within our inclusion and diversity communities, that for those of us that are doing this work, we tend to still be in our own silos, if you will. And so can we all learn how to be more inclusive amongst what we're doing? And then we become, I guess, more impactful to the communities around us, right? Like I want to learn more about what Bryce does. I want to learn more about what Divan does, and just kind of build into that. And Tabitha, you know, just kind of saying, all right, what is that? What's happening there that I can encourage, that I'm aware of, and not be so isolated. But having said that, I think that's a very cultural approach that I'm taking by saying, let's be inclusive as an inclusion people, versus from the West, generally, people tend to be a little bit more silo oriented, right? And in this country, in the US especially, it's all about who you are, your lane, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, figure it out. And, you know, it's just kind of that whole mindset. I don't come from that mindset. And so my passion around inclusion is to have all of us even be more inclusive as individuals and the work that we're doing, so that we can grow forward together, which is the tagline of my company.
Thank you very much. Can we go to, where is she?
Maya said she had to leave.
Oh, okay. Let's go to Dr. Flynn.
Well, I'll just go back to the first point I made, which is around timeframes. We have, from our financial system to our educational system and other, we have discounted the future. We have a whole financial system based on discounting the future. And after a couple generations since that system was made up, it's pretty well discounted. And that in the things that we're working on are deep cultural, structural changes that take decades to unfold. We have a tendency to confuse the urgent with the important. And that the reality is, and we all know it, but we act like it's not so, is that none of us survive in the long run. That's the silliest objective ever. None of us do. The point is, what kind of world do we leave behind? What kind of world are we making on for our kids and grandkids and the future generations? How do we re-empower the future so that it matters more than the present? And that's a deep, deep psychological change that is not going to come with a slogan. But unless we all start looking at not how do we solve this issue today, but how do we begin to transform so that over the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, the children unborn today will be born into a world that is inherently inclusive, and it's not a secondary issue. It is the nature of survival through collaboration and cooperation, as opposed to the illusion of survival through competition.
Thank you very much. And that's probably be a good way to get to this. And my proposition is this. Whether we believe it or not, we have some, what I consider as artificial walls. And these artificial walls are not readily seen, but they're there. Now, when we go back to what Kenita said about how do we learn from one another to hopefully begin to figure how we can infuse these things we learn in order to do better. And so when Flynn came and indicated that, like asking the kind of world we want to leave behind, as he said, nobody survives this. But the question becomes, what kind of world are we going to leave behind for those who are coming before us? So I would say that it's incumbent upon all of us to do our part in context of looking at what are the ways I can help. If you have the tendency to see some terrible things going on and then you don't say anything about it, you just be silent or just walk away, perhaps we could begin as individuals, begin as talking to our friends. This is not gonna help. We have to begin to talk to one another, because people are by nature good. What happens is that when all the frailties come in, it sort of compels you to rewire, whether it's for survival or to retaliate or whatever form you want to do it. So by and large, let's use it in a productive way, as I had indicated in my book, where when you get to know people, even if they're bad people, you have a window to understanding how they act, what propelled them to act. And then you have opportunity to perhaps let them know that there are alternative ways of acting. And by so doing, you develop a new concept. If I will borrow from Flynn, then you begin to sort of reframing it. The person will begin to reframe what he had always done or what he knew. In course of doing that, the person does better. Maya Angelou reminds us that as you learn better, you do better. And on that note, I want to thank all of you, especially the panelists. I very much appreciate it. And Flynn's friend, we really appreciate your comments. It resonated with me. So I'm so glad that you all came. And thank you.